was the American scene in the summer of 1831. Little fields of waving grain, arduously planted, cultivated by back-breaking toil, and harvested with crude implements which had been little improved for centuries. Until recent generations, farmers were using the same reaping hooks and sickles as the ancient Egyptians. With a sickle, a man could cut only half an acre of grain in a long, hard day. Truly, mankind was shackled to the soil, engaged in an endless struggle for bread. Centuries after the sickle came the scythe. Even though using both hands, one man could cut only 2.5 acres a day. Out of the scythe came the cradle, with long fingers to lay the grain in rows, and binding became easier. These three hand tools, the tools of famine, slavery, and failure, represented the entire progress of harvesting implements until just a little more than 100 years ago. In this peaceful setting, an event took place which was destined to change the entire course of agriculture and banish the drudgery of hand farming. Here in the valley of the Blue Ridge Mountains was the old McCormick homestead, and here we shall see an historically faithful reenactment of the building of the world's first successful reaper. On this Virginia farm stood the old McCormick blacksmith shop, which became the birthplace of that instrument of freedom, the reaper. It was only a crude farm smithy where Cyrus Hall McCormick at 22 worked on his invention, but he was impelled by the same driving power which has ever caused men of vision to toil on until that which is an idea takes physical shape. Others had tried to invent a mechanical reaper for which there was a desperate need. Over all the world, new lands were being opened to agriculture. The development of America was waiting for some better, cheaper way to harvest grain. And the tools of old were like so many ancient fetters on the limbs of men. Young McCormick, as a boy of 15, had already made an improved cradle by which he was able to keep up with able-bodied men in the field. Later, he invented a plow which threw alternate furrows on either side. It was his vision of a new day on the farm which fired him to accomplish what had long been only a cherished dream in the minds of many men. A source of the young man's inspiration was his father, Robert McCormick, who had attempted to design a mechanical reaper as far back as 1816 and again in the year 1831. The elder McCormick had devised other machines for mill and farm, but the key to the riddle of the reaper was not to be his. Some of the friends and neighbors in the community were highly sympathetic and encouraging to young Cyrus. Such was Colonel James McDowell, full of faith in the boy's ability and perseverance. To others, such as Captain William Massey, the problem seemed impossible of solution. Doubt and skepticism characterized the manner and words of the captain. He typified the people of the day, believing it a waste of time and energy to try to create a mechanical reaper. It was the firm conviction of such men that there must always be the toilers with their scythes and cradles in the fields. Undaunted by such cynicism and encouraged by the faith of his friends, McCormick persevered. With his only helper, the faithful servant Joe Anderson, he fitted each piece, bit by bit, as gradually a basic part took shape. The knife blade on which he worked was to be propelled forward through the grain, cutting it with a side-to-side motion. Out of this sliding cutting bar evolved a principle which has since been embodied in all successful harvesting machines. One interested observer was William, younger brother of the inventor. He visited the shop and the field many times while the frame took shape around a great wooden bull wheel. This main wheel was designed to carry the weight of the machine and to impart motion to both reel and cutting blade as the machine was pulled along the ground. Captain Massey had called it a contraption. No doubt it was a strange creation to one who could not visualize how all these parts would work. Other interested spectators were the two younger brothers, Leander and John. The workshop was to them just another spot in their rounds of play over the serene and comfortable home farm. It was with only the usual fascination of young boys for mechanical oddities that they watched the work progress. But there was one who had unbounded faith in Cyrus, Mary Ann Hall McCormick, his mother. Full of solicitude lest he exhaust himself, she was proud of her son's desire to finish his work in time for the present harvest. For in that day of tedious toil, much time was required to cut the grain, and as always, it must be gathered at just the right time. It was the farmer's greatest dread that once the grain was ripe, the weather would not hold fair until it was gathered. With this in mind, McCormick kept at the job constantly, hardly stopping for meals. While the elder McCormick had abandoned his own effort to build a practical reaper, he was intensely interested in the progress of the work under the hands of his son. Cyrus McCormick began at the point where other inventors had failed. Others had relied on knives which worked like a scythe, or on a rotary cutter, or on one which worked like vibrating shears. But McCormick's sliding cutting bar was to prove the sound and lasting device which has prevailed in all of the reapers with which we are familiar today. But the knife alone was not enough to reap the standing grain. It was necessary to find a means of cutting that which had fallen and become a tangled mass. A reel would be needed, large enough to reach forward and pick up the low-lying stalks and press them against the blade. And so, part by part, under the inspiration of his sympathetic parents, the young inventor strove toward his goal. It was now approaching the end of summer. The short harvesting period always rushed by so fast that tons of grain often lay rotting in the fields. Cyrus could not wait for another season. This workshop was a far cry from the modern laboratories and machine shops of today, where scientists, chemists, draftsmen, and mechanical engineers turn out our modern inventions. The materials of Cyrus McCormick's time were only the native hardwoods of the Virginia hills and pieces of iron. Iron which had to be patterned and shaped by hand at the forge. The metallurgical knowledge we have today and the devices for cutting gears and casting metal parts were unheard of then. Here was a young man who had never seen a railroad, had never been to college, using only such knowledge as he had gained on the farm and materials found at hand. In that early day, all the great basic inventions had great obstacles to overcome. The cotton gin of Eli Whitney, the steamboat of Robert Fulton, the sewing machine of Elias Howe, and on down the line of machines which did so much to change our lives and times, so much to add to the ease of living in the past 100 years. Day by day, the reaper grew from an idea into a machine. The fingers at the edge of the cutting blade solved the problem of supporting the grain while it was being cut. McCormick developed another important feature, which he called the outside divider, a curved arm to separate the grain to be cut from that which was left standing. With so many innovations, it was small wonder that the doubting ones were convinced that young McCormick was wasting his time. How could these various parts all function together? Wasn't it too much to believe that this main wheel moving along the ground could motivate these crudely shaped parts and make them work? Captain Massey thought so, but the determined inventor felt safe in declaring that within a few days' time, before this harvest was over, they would see this machine really cutting grain. At last the day for a public test arrived. Cyrus's own mother and father, the boys, and his sisters Amanda Joanna and Mary Caroline, had already gone to the appointed place. Colonel McDowell's family, loyal and hopeful, were among the first to start for the field. Captain Massey was not the only one who traveled to the neighboring field convinced that a failure would be witnessed. And one more man marked with derision as a crazy inventor. Naturally, the projected experiment had been noised about the countryside. Farmers, villagers, and their families trudged for miles to take in the show. This would be just about as good as a circus. Probably more were prepared to have a good laugh than to applaud at the test of neighbor McCormick's new-fangled grain cutter. Such as it was, the reaper was ready for its test. Last-minute preparations at the old blacksmith shop found Joe as he hitched up, excited over the prospect, much more so than the inventor himself, who had gone to dress for the occasion. But for every neighbor who found time to visit the field, several others felt they dared not leave the harvesting. The loss of any precious hour when the crop was right to be cut, with the danger of the grain becoming too ripe and breaking down, might be disastrous. Of course, the inventor would take a last-minute look at his creation to see that every part was ready for the first public appearance. The drive wheel, the reel, the cutting bar, all were in place. And Joe's important duty was to be the raker, drawing the grain from the platform, which had been designed to catch it. Farmers, whose backs were bent and whose fingers were scarred from the harvest labor, glanced with contemptuous curiosity at the queer rig, which was expected to cut grain without the use of the hands. The barnyard Doubting Thomases were not giving up their cradles just yet. No siree. It was only a rough Virginia road, but it proved to be young McCormick's road of destiny, his pathway to service for all humanity. The historic spot where the first public exhibition of the cutting of grain by a mechanical reaper took place was close by the old McCormick homestead. It was in a field of late grain owned by John Steele at the nearby hamlet of Steele's Tavern. As family, friends, and neighbors gathered, waiting for McCormick and his reaper to appear, an air of curious expectancy was in the crowd. The confident ones and the doubters were on hand. Which would be right when the machine was put to the test in the waving grain? At last, young Cyrus and his lumbering reaper entered the field and moved down toward the grain. Part of John Steele's field had already been cut by hand. Now they would see whether McCormick's invention could do as well. The little group around the machine was eager to get a good look at the contrivance. Here, indeed, was a strange monstrosity. A pioneer, hopefully plodding westward with his few goods, his axe and his scythe, looked curiously at the scene which seemed to concern him little. He could not know what this invention would mean to him in the development of the West. The onlookers wondered, why doesn't it go? Will it go? They would believe it when they really saw it work. Miracle of miracles, young McCormick's invention was actually reaping grain. To the amazement of all, the contraption that had amused the countryside was literally marching down the field, cutting grain just as clean as a whistle. The crowd saw with its own eyes a clean line being marked off by the divider, the reel pressing the grain toward the blade. The stationary fingers hold the stalks firmly against the knife. The platform catching the grain 6 times faster than grain ever fell before. They saw the ponderous creation jolting down John Steele's field on its big main wheel, and the stout gears which Cyrus had fashioned with his own hands, impelling motion to all these fantastic parts. It was clumsy as an ox cart, but it reaped. It proved that the basic idea which the young man had worked out was sound. Here was a scene to make historians wonder why most men had been content with the same farm tools which had been used for centuries, while the world was crying for bread. Here was a nation which had been established for more than 50 years, but so far no grain had ever been cut by machine. And today we can realize the magnitude of the event when we consider that if we reaped our grain as the Romans did with sickle and scythe, it would require half the population to produce our bread, not to mention the rest of the food we eat. Here indeed was an eventful day. The world's first successful reaper, Cyrus McCormick's machine, had cut as much as 6 men could have cut by the best methods in use before that time. History had been made that day on a little Virginia farm. The hopes and dreams of a father had come true through the genius, the will, and determination of his son. "Your reaper is a success," Robert McCormick told him, "and I am proud to have a son do what I could not do." Doubt and cynicism gave way to conviction. Even Massey was among the first to offer congratulations. And so the pioneer moved westward, followed by wave on wave of emigration. But none dreamed that their sons would see in this machine, and others descended from it, the means of building an agricultural empire in the West far beyond the horizon of their imagination. To have invented the reaper in 1831 was not enough. Nearly 10 years passed before McCormick was ready to make his first sale. With characteristic tenacity, he kept improving and demonstrating it to a still somewhat dubious world. In 1847, McCormick established his own factory in Chicago, thus starting the world's greatest harvesting machine works. By 1851, an improved cutting mechanism was added, and another feature, a seat for the raker. That year, the reaper took first prize at the London exhibition. In 1855, the reaper won the gold medal at the Paris exposition. This was another step in the progress of the harvest, the self-raking reaper, the first truly one-man machine. In 1858 came the Marsh harvester, cutting 10 acres a day. 2 men riding on the machine tied the grain by hand. This was the forerunner of the self-binding machines, as the grain was delivered to an elevated platform in the right position to be bound. The first self-binder appeared in the 70s. 2 steel fingers moved back and forth and twisted a wire band around each sheaf of grain. It increased the cut to as much as 14 acres a day. But the farmers were afraid that the wire might injure the cattle, and something better was needed. The answer was the first twine binder, an amazing development of the early 80s. Steel arms flashed a cord around a bundle of grain, tied a knot, cut the cord, and kicked off the sheaf. 1 man could harvest 20 acres of grain in 1 day. With the development of power farming came the tractor binder. The tractor not only drawing the binder, but also furnishing, through the power takeoff, direct driving power to operate the machine and binding mechanism. It harvested 35 acres a day, almost twice as much as any horse-drawn binder. A long step forward from the old wooden main wheel of 1831. Latest and greatest of all harvesting machines is the harvester thresher, or combine, the great-grandchild of McCormick's first reaper. With all the modern refinements added to those basic principles, this giant of farm machines is far beyond the imagination of the people who watched that first simple reaper. Rolling steadily across the fields, the combine cuts, threshes, and cleans in one operation from 15 to 50 acres in a single day. Beneath the sound of this most advanced harvester thresher is still the soft whir of that first reaper. Continual development through the years has produced this marvelous machine where the threshed, clean grain is delivered to the grain tank, and the straw and chaff are returned to the soil to help maintain productivity. The respective models of the harvester thresher have been adapted to every grain, seed, or bean in all the great crop areas of the world. There's the right adaptation for every crop condition, and the right size of machine for every size farm. Serving the smallest and the largest, there's the correct model and equipment for every section of the country, whether in the hills, on the plains, or in the rice fields. The sun never sets on these machines as they harvest the world's great crops of grain, seeds, and beans for all mankind. These machines that have grown and developed from the first successful reaper on a Virginia farm. From reaping hook to combine, from drudgery to bountiful production on the farm, from worldwide want to worldwide plenty, such is the romantic saga of progress that began with Cyrus Hall McCormick's invention in 1831. The romance of the reaper.